Well, there has been a lot of attempts on my father's life, throughout his life. From the time that probably the most notorious spy agencies at that time, KGB, was trying to assassinate him multiple times that he survived, to after that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, many times that finally they succeeded. Although there has been some warnings to my father that be careful with interviews, be careful with cameras, but my father always wanted to pass the message as broad as possible and as far as possible to bring awareness to Afghanistan that Afghanistan needs to be paid attention to. So I believe he felt taking the risk was worth it in exchange for expanding the message and expressing the grave situation of Afghanistan. And that's exactly what I do. Beside that I know you, so this was not a question of risk or worry. So this was all just fine.
Perfect. Could we get into a little bit? I want to give the audience some context that don't know much of the history about your father and the parallels that you have. And so I remember I've been to Afghanistan more times than I can count. I remember the very first time I landed in Kabul airport, going through Massoud Circle, an iconic circle, and so many things are named after your father. Can you go into a little bit of the legacy of what your father was about?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, my father has been always very much famous for being a military genius. He managed to withstand multiple major attacks by the Russians and managed to withstand against the might of global terrorism. And he managed to bring unity against such sort of chaos. And he was the centerpiece in fighting against the Soviet and fighting against the terrorism. In Afghanistan, he's very much famous for being the national hero of Afghanistan, that saving country multiple times from such invasions, from such chaos and crises. However, at the same time, he proved to be as a very political genius too. That his decisions, his foresight, for example, knowing what would happen with 9/11, for example, that months before that, he warned United States of America and he warned the world that the issue of Afghanistan would reach to the soil of America and it would be catastrophic. And exactly that happened. So his foresight, his charisma, his honesty to his people, and his devotion, that he never allowed himself to leave his country, and he was ready, and ultimately he did, give the ultimate price, which was giving his own life. So that devotion and that sort of charisma and that love for his country and that hard work is something that created not just a legacy of a genius, but a legacy of hope. So what I can basically conclude is that my father was a symbol of hope for his people. And his values was to the extent that people who were his enemies, like Russian generals, they admired him. His enemies admired him. And his fame and his sort of love went all the way from Argentina to South Korea to Japan to across the world, that the people who got to know him, they fell in love with that idea, with his cause, and his determination to follow those values. He was a man of principle.
It's my understanding he was assassinated on September 9th by Osama bin Laden, correct? Yes. 2 days before 9/11 happened.
Yes.
Do you know why they assassinated him before 9/11?
Of course, Al-Qaeda had a plan to take over Afghanistan. And ultimately, their goal was to expand their sort of government across the globe and have that their, which is against all the values of Islam, their Islamic Khilafah, which is something they wanted. And they found out that there is an obstacle on their way. To do it, they needed a territory. And the best territory was a war-torn country called Afghanistan, that they have already been there for many years because of fighting against the Soviets. So they felt this war-torn country is the best place that they can explore, expand, and train and recruit, and from there make it a jumping ground, basically, to go to and spread to across the world. But one thing they didn't realize and they didn't take into account was the presence of a man called Ahmad Shah Massoud that created a resistance against such idea. And he was a symbol of Muslim moderation, Islamic moderation, which is the majority of Muslims, that they do not share anything with those extremists like Al-Qaeda and those terrorist groups. So when he stood against them, he was far more dangerous to Al-Qaeda than America and the others. Because first, he was representing Islamic majority or majority of Muslims. Second, he was on the ground fighting against them, and he managed to defeat them time after time on battleground. We had video evidences that you can find it even on YouTube of these terrorists, Al-Qaeda terrorists, that we captured them. And they were detained in our prisons. And my father had them in his prisons as a proof that Al-Qaeda is alongside Taliban in this fight. And we had people from Chechnya, people from different parts of Africa. These global terrorism, alongside the Taliban, they were fighting against my father.
So all of the terrorist organizations were working together against your father's resistance.
Yes. And they did not succeed. My father, with his companion and with the rest of people of Afghanistan, they fought all alone for many years against the Taliban and their allies, which was international terrorism, like Al-Qaeda. And he not only managed to resist and prevent it, that at later stages, the Al-Qaeda and Taliban realized that he was undefeatable on the ground. Just the way that the Russian realized he is undefeatable. So when it happened, Al-Qaeda changed their tactic. Their tactic was that now that we cannot defeat him in the battlefield, on the ground, let's assassinate him. And this was the second phase that they started planning.